Jonathan, welcome to the Health Path podcast, and thank you for sparing some time to come and chat with me today.
Looking forward to it, Alex.
I've kind of came across you actually last year. You probably won't know this, but I was signed up with the Psychedelic Society to do the MDMA training that you offer that hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about a little bit today. But I had to pull out last minute. But since then I've read your book. I've done a little bit more reading around this, and I'm really excited to kind of just share this chat with our listeners today. Um, Before we dive into it, are you happy just to share a little bit of your backstory, which obviously is a nice foundation for today's talk?
Sure. Yeah, I was blessed to grow up in a very dysfunctional family. And I say blessed because that got me focused on how to be happy when you have no control over your outer circumstances. By age 12, I was into hypnosis and self-help books and meditation. By 15, I was a certified hypnotist. And then by 16, I think I'd tried LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, and everything else. I was always looking for what could heal myself. And I realized early on I was pretty lazy. So I was looking for anything that was very easy to do that would have profound effects. And that's what got me into, writing self-help books and eventually getting on Oprah and having bestsellers because other people are lazy too. They want the easiest way to change. And so I made a career of it, basically.
And I think I'm right in saying that you did your PhD on MDMA just before it became illegal. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, it was my master's
Your
degree on
master's.
MDMA. And we showed that you could basically cure PTSD in one MDMA session. Well, back then, there was no cure for PTSD. People would go to 5 years of therapy and they'd improve 10%. We were basically curing people in 5 hours. And the results were so incredible. My supervisor asked me to do the study again, but by then the US government had made it illegal, so you couldn't do it. So in the 40 years since, I've been what's called an underground therapist. I am a psychotherapist, but I would do this so-called illegally. And I've led maybe 800 journeys in the last 40 years. And now I teach a course where I teach coaches, therapists, healers how to do this therapy as well.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I'd love to sort of dive into that. And I found it really interesting actually just at the beginning of your book where you were talking about the differences. So obviously there's maps that have their sort of more recent clinical trials looking at MDMA. So unless you feel there's a better place to start, are you happy to talk maybe about some of the differences we see in the research and your system or your model, for want of a better word?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. MAPS, which is stands for Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, they funded research to get MDMA approved by the US FDA. Now, FDA stands for Food and Drug Administration. It doesn't stand for the Food and Therapy Administration. So MAPS funded studies to show that just giving people a pill with no therapy could cure them of PTSD.
Hmm.
And in fact, they did show that it was incredibly effective. That's why the FDA is likely to make MDMA a legally prescribed drug later this year. And they've never done that in its entire history, made a legal drug legal. But the results are so great that they feel compelled to do that. Now, MAPS wanted to show that just this pill could cure people because it's not a therapy thing. But when you combine therapy with MDMA, it's much more effective, obviously. So the MAPS protocol was just put a blindfold on people and have them listen to music and hope that they get cured of PTSD. Well, my protocol was always based on therapy. So I give people MDMA or they take MDMA, and then we dive into their issues. And we can generally cure PTSD very quickly. It's also great for anxiety, depression, couples issues. It's also great for spiritual acceleration. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife of therapy. And so I developed this protocol that involved, an hour session learning what their issues are, what success looks like, then a 5 hour journey with the medicine, and then an integration session about a week later, which I consider very important because you want to take the insights from the session and put them into their daily life. So I developed a whole methodology around that. And the results are almost ridiculously good. I'm getting 10 requests to do this therapy a day, and it's pretty intense. And now hundreds of people are taking the training.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And it's so interesting to sort of just know the differences that I think I'm right in saying, obviously, as you say there, the maps results are really impressive. And that's just lying down with an eye mask on, listening to some music. So you can imagine incorporating some of the strategies that we might just touch on today is going
Hmm.
to kind of just act as a bit of a catalyst there. Um, okay, so I guess with that in mind, it might worth just be touching on sort of this sort of therapeutic side of things a little bit more, because I
Hmm.
guess MDMA has a certain reputation. A lot of people might have only really thought about it as a drug that's taken during raves, etc. So is there
Hmm.
anything that you want to just share to help people understand this a little bit more?
Well, people who've taken it in raves, well, when they then take it in a therapeutic context, they're amazed at how different it is.
Hmm,
It doesn't necessarily strike you as a therapeutic drug until you take it in that context.
right.
Uh, but the early days, that's what it was used for. And then, I asked myself, how are people going to abuse this drug? We never thought of that people would use as a dance party drug. You know, I like to use the analogy that a laptop can be used as a doorstop, but there's better uses for a laptop, and MDMA can be used as a dance party drug, but there's better uses for MDMA. And um, I think of it as doing 2 or 3 years of therapy in one afternoon. Because as a therapist, you have to spend a lot of time getting rapport and getting trust and getting through people's defenses. That can take a year or two. With MDMA, it takes about 10 minutes. And therefore, you can almost like do brain surgery where you're like rewiring their brain. And it's very satisfying. It's very sacred. It's very moving. People often report that it's one of the most wonderful experiences of their life, even though they're dealing with going into challenging issues at times.
Yeah. In your experience, have you worked with any clients whereby maybe they're coming to you for something like anxiety and depression, but they have um some other conditions? I'm just thinking of anything from chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, sort of
Mm.
some of these health things that we know can be connected to what's going on, I guess, within our psyche, if I put it very generally.
Yeah, that's a great question. Only about 15 people. So that's, out of 800, that's not a lot. Um, and I would say I've had about an 80% success rate and people feeling like they really moved forward and not necessarily cured, but they were at a different place afterwards, which
Mm,
is less of my success than, say, with PTSD or other things.
okay.
But there's a lot of factors in those
Yeah.
conditions. And a lot of times have been able to unearth something that was really keeping people stuck. It could be a belief, it could be some trauma from their childhood. And when you unearth that and work on it, people kind of get to the next level of health, along with some other, medical things that they might be doing.
That's really interesting. Okay, good to know. And I guess one of the things that you've started to touch on there is really the importance of set and setting. You said how people who have used it more in the rave scene when they take it therapeutically are surprised by sort of the difference in the experience. So would you mind just touching on sort of that and some of the things that you might consider, I guess, as being important when we're thinking about set and setting?
Mhm. Well, I'll share a couple of interesting stories and then go into that. One is my parents were wondering why I was so enthusiastic about this drug, and they said, "Can we take it?" Which surprised me, but I said, "Okay." And I create a good set and setting for them. I told them how to, set themselves up for that. A year later, I asked them if they'd taken it, and they said that they had. And I said, "Well, what happened?" And they said it had no effect, which surprised me. So I said, "Well, what'd you end up doing that night?" And they reported that, they waited like 20 minutes and nothing happened. Well, it takes about 45 minutes for the drug to take effect. And I said, "Well, after you felt like nothing happened, what'd you do?" "Oh, well, we ended up sitting on the couch and talking about how much we loved each other and how wonderful our lives were. And then we cuddled for a couple hours. It ended up being the greatest night of our marriage. The only disappointment was the drug didn't take effect." So, of course, I was laughing this whole time because they didn't realize that MDMA did all those things because it doesn't feel like other psychedelics where you're on a drug. It
Mm,
feels like your best, most open self. So the set and setting by itself is helpful. I did work with a client a few months back, where um, he took the wrong pill. He took a magnesium pill that helps with some of the side effects instead of the MDMA. But we both thought he had taken the MDMA, and we had created the set and setting. And he had a wonderful experience. He said he was experiencing more love and peace than he'd ever had in his life. Well, that night when he was supposed to take the magnesium pill, he took the MDMA pill, and then he had another 5 hour trip of love, and he thought I had tricked him, but he had just made a mistake. And just having the set and setting where you think you're about to go on a trip and you're ready and you've made that commitment in yourself is part of the package, and part of what makes this therapy helpful, even if you weren't taking actual MDMA.
yeah, I love those stories, especially your parents.
Yeah, yeah.
I can very much see that. And I guess that's really important to know in regards to just to have some level of expectation in regards to what it feels like. Because as you say, I think my only experiences with psilocybin, and it sounds like it would be a very different experience ultimately without the hallucinations and things like this.
Yeah, and on psilocybin, which is quite effective for depression, studies show, um, you're not so much in relationship with somebody else
Mm,
that's guiding the trip, especially if you have a high dose, it's like,
yeah.
where's my foot? But um, but on MDMA, people are very clear-headed, more so than usual,
Mm,
and therefore they're able to look at some of their psychological challenges much more honestly and effectively than normal.
okay. Brilliant. Um, so with all that in mind, as always, feel free to sort of direct the conversation to where you feel might be the most appropriate place to go. But I guess people might be curious around um, your process, maybe. For example, if there's anything that you're happy to sort of share within the context of our conversation,
Mhm.
just whether it's kind of again sharing some case studies or just learning a little bit more about what it would look like if we sort of reached out to you, I guess.
Mhm. Well, some questions I get a lot, both in the training and therapeutically, is um, a lot of people are concerned about the after effects, because sometimes people are getting impure medicine.
Yeah.
And a lot of the after effects that people associate with MDMA really is due to not MDMA, it's due to it being mixed with other things. So when people work with me, I have a way that they can get pure medicine, and they don't have to worry about that. And the same thing in the training, that you want to make sure you're getting the real stuff. And there's a process where I've been able to do that that doesn't run into legal issues. Um, Another aspect that people ask about is, uh, will it help me in my particular situation? And I like to say that it's really like a Swiss Army knife. It creates a suitable soil for you to look at whatever is blocking you from peace and love, because it does bring on a feeling of peace and love quite strongly. And then I ask people, well, what's normally in the way of you having this experience? And what's interesting is that people tend to know right away. If I ask that question before they were on MDMA, they go, I don't know. But on MDMA, they go, it's this, and then we explore that. Sometimes the medicine actually brings up stuff that people are very unaware of. It might be physical or sexual abuse or something like that. One story is my wife and I, about 8 years ago, were having problems in our marriage. And to be more precise, she was getting angry at me virtually all the time for little things like keeping the lights on or something, or walking too loudly. And this was very uncharacteristic for her. Well, we didn't know why this was happening, so I actually hired a guide to guide us on MDMA, because it's kind of hard to guide yourself. When you're feeling blissed out, like, I'll just bliss out. But with a guide, what showed up was that her aunt had died 3 months earlier, who she was close to, but she was too busy at the time to visit her aunt. And she was very upset at herself for not being there for her aunt. And she ended up crying and having to forgive herself while I held her. Well, long story short, after the trip, her anger at me was completely gone. So she and I were totally unaware that this anger was due to anything related to her aunt or being mad at herself. But the medicine seems to have an intelligence that brings up what needs to be looked at to be healed. And I
Mm.
find that fascinating. I always write down what they want, what they think the issues are, but I always let the medicine lead because it seems to have its own intelligence.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that. We've had a few guests on over the years talking about psychedelics, mainly psilocybin, but this idea of the medicine having of sort of an innate intelligence is a really interesting, curious one.
Mhm.
What just popped into my mind? There was something I wanted to expand on there. Ah, yes, I mean, last week I spoke to an IFS therapist here in the UK, and just what you were sharing there, it got me thinking whether there's any research or whether it feels like there could be a good fit between internal family systems and MDMA. Um,
Yeah.
is
Well,
there anything you can share there?
in the training I do, and if people want to find out about that, they can go to mdmatraining.net
Okay.
uh, and learn all about it and even apply if they want. Um, I teach 10 different healing modalities because not everybody who takes the training is a therapist. I don't require that. One of them is IFS. And
Okay.
to tell you the truth, IFS has a whole 2 year training process. I'm not a trained IFS therapist. I am a mediocre IFS therapist. But on MDMA, I'm an amazing IFS therapist because MDMA does the heavy lifting. You can say, go with the achiever part. Let me hear what it has to say. And, people can do that right away. They don't need any prelude, or tell me about the inner critic, and the inner critic talks to you. This is what I need. This is what I'm wanting. What can we do about this? So it's really fun to do IFS, internal family systems, when somebody's on MDMA. And the same is true for almost every other therapeutic modality. What might
Okay.
take, EMDR, EFT, all these different initials, all these different modalities, they work maybe 50 times better or 10 times better, at least when somebody's on MDMA, because you're already at that deep level of mind, and the normal protective devices and fear is gone. MDMA reduces blood flow to the amygdala, so people are kind of fearless, and that's why they can go into difficult spaces or trauma and not feel fear. And when you associate a traumatic thing with total relaxation, love, and acceptance, the two kind of neutralize each other. Therefore, the
Mm.
trauma or PTSD tends to uh, be fully digested and not show up anymore.
That's really interesting, especially around sort of the amygdala and the role that MDMA plays there. We had Ashok Gupta on the podcast recently talking about the Gupta program, which is kind of one of those brain retraining programs when maybe
Mm,
there might be some, for want of a better way of putting it, imbalances within the amygdala, and that body and brain is sort of in that chronic fight or flight response.
right.
So I think people have some understanding around what you kind of just discussed there. Are there any other mechanisms that we're aware of with MDMA, or do you have any of your own theories in regards to how it works?
Well, they've just done some interesting research. I talk about this in the Ecstasy as Medicine book, where both MDMA and the other psychedelics increase what's called the critical learning period. Now, when we're like young, like two, we learn things really quickly, whether it be a new language or a new skill. And that's due to a certain part of the brain that uh, is open to new learning. And when we become an adult, that part of our brain just kind of closes down. Well, it ends up that these psychedelics re-stimulate that part of the brain. So it's much easier to change behavior or worldview after taking a psychedelic trip. And so now Big Pharma is getting into it. They said, well, that's amazing. Let's figure out some way to make other drugs that can open up this critical learning period. And I think in this day and age where things are so crazy in the world, that we have to adapt quicker than we've ever had to
Mm.
before. So because our brains are still in the Stone Age, we may have to kind of upgrade them through psychedelics or other things so we are more open to learning and changing throughout our life because the world's changing so fast.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think some of what you shared just recently got me thinking around sort of the section in your book around MDMA and how people use it with other psychedelics. Um,
Mhm.
and I'm wondering whether it would be worth now just sort of touching on sort of some of the common combinations and why I guess we might consider them, because certainly I was really surprised that this happens ultimately when I first heard it.
Well, you probably haven't tried it because once you try it, a lot of people will say that combining MDMA with a certain amount of psilocybin is the holy grail of both therapy and the best experience a human being can have. And that's called hippie flipping.
Okay.
Combining MDMA with LSD is called candy flipping, which I think is maybe a little bit less use, but um, studies are just starting about this, that each of these medicines bring a certain thing to the table, and when you
Mm,
combine them in the right amount, you're kind of creating a state of mind that is totally open and totally able to take in new information at a very deep level. But a lot of these studies take 10 years and $20 million to do. So they're not easy to do. Um, I have personal experience with combining MDMA with small amounts of psilocybin, and I do find that uh, it is perhaps the most flexible state of consciousness. I feel like I can do a dance party rave, or I could go into trauma work, or I can meditate, or I could become one with the universe. It's pretty interesting that way.
mm,
Um, Most of the time, I only just use the ecstasy in my sessions because something I've been doing since COVID, which is surprising to everybody, is I do almost all my sessions over Zoom.
yeah.
Now, I did maybe 400 guided sessions before Zoom and maybe 300 after, which are on Zoom. And I would have to say that the Zoom sessions get even better results.
Mm.
Now, this surprised everybody. It surprised Maps and Rick Doblin. It surprised me. And people ask me, why is that the case? And my best guess is that you are creating the highest level of safety possible. You know, when if a woman's been sexually raped or whatever, and you know, unfortunately, and I'm asking them to come to my office and take a drug that makes them vulnerable, that's a big ask. That's kind of feels unsafe for a lot of people. But on Zoom, you already feel safety. Hey, if I don't like how it's going, I just, you know, push a button. Um, that plus the MDMA makes people feel incredibly safe, which allows a deep therapeutic process to work. And the other thing which surprised me is that, you know, I tell people if you want to listen to music or have a blindfold on during any of this time, just let me know. Well, so far we're 0 for 300 that way. Nobody has ever said, I'd like to now, you know, use a blindfold and listen to music. They love going into their stuff, and they don't have a problem looking at a screen for 5 hours.
Mm.
I'm the one that says, hey, let's take a 10-minute break so I can go to the bathroom. They just sit there and go, oh, I'm really happy here, you know. So that's been really surprising. And it also expands the ability of people to access this. You know, half my clients are in the UK or Europe. Um, and I just do it over Zoom. And it also makes it a lot cheaper. You
Mm.
know, when the FDA makes this a legal drug in the United States, they expect that these clinics that will open up will charge about $15,000 because they'll require 2 therapists with PhDs and 3 sessions and all this stuff, which is unfortunate. Whereas most of the therapists I train are charging somewhere between $500 and $2,000. You know, that's a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
And my goal is to get people, you know, millions of people to have access to this therapeutic breakthrough rather than just a few rich people.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to appreciate about how it's sort of unfolding ultimately, that there are going to be some serious limitations in its accessibility to begin with. And with the sort of that MAPS protocol that's coming into sort of action, is that still going to be, you mentioned sort of there is therapy, but is that just after the lying down with the music and the eye mask? It's not anything like what you are teaching even then.
Right, right. They don't do any actual therapy while somebody's on MDMA. They do therapy afterwards, though.
Okay.
Um, so in my training, we talk about that different protocol where people do therapy. I teach them a lot of different methods. And equally important is I teach them a lot about how to help people integrate their insights and behavior changes into daily life.
Mm.
I developed a motivational method, which you probably read about in the book, which is quite unique, that works incredibly well. Um, and I'm very proud of that method. It takes about 3 minutes a week. And if people use that method, the changes are pretty much guaranteed. Um, so, you know, the idea of teaching therapists, coaches this and letting them go with it, I think is really what my mission is at this point, because the math protocol really won't be very prominent just because it'll cost so much money
Mm.
and won't be able to reach that many people. When they do get the FDA approval, though, what's going to happen is the underground um, field of doing this therapy is going to expand really quick because people will be reading about it in the paper.
Yeah.
That's why I'm trying to train. I'm trying to train 10,000 therapists, coaches, healers to do this type of therapy so that it's available. I'm getting so many requests. I get 10 requests a day now, and you know it's getting a little bit ridiculous. I keep referring, here's my referral list. Do it that
Right.
because I'm booked for a year.
Is there I'm not sure if you mentioned this in the book, but is there sort of a referral list available for people, sort of a database of people you've trained that people can
Mhm.
find? There is.
Yeah, there is. People can go to xtcasmedicine.com and email me. for the referral list, and I will send them the referral list for free. They also can get their for free if they put in their email 10 ways to avoid bad psychedelic trips, and also 12 questions that lead to instant intimacy with anyone, which is great for couples to use while they're on MDMA.
Mm,
So I like to give away a lot of stuff for free just because I don't need the money, and it's helpful to people. And I want to make sure they're using this medicine in the correct way, because there are ways to abuse it.
right.
There are contraindications. You shouldn't take MDMA with antidepressants or MAO inhibitors. There's a lot of nuance. That's why the training actually has 30 hours of material plus a lot of practice sessions. It's not something where you can read a book and just do it. There's a lot of subtlety, and I want to make sure people are doing it right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I assume just going back to sort of the MAPS protocol and when there is this sort of which is accessible but incredibly expensive. Am I right in assuming that that will also only be in person? There's not going to be a sort of,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, that will only be in person. I have talked to Rick Doblin, the head of MAPS, about my protocol, and he's super excited about it. And he's actually trying to raise another, $50 million so we can do these studies. But it's not
Brilliant.
that won't be something that these studies literally take 10 years and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
So for me, the proof is in the pudding, in the fact that people are getting such great results. But for the next decade or so, the only legal clinics will be the ones with the MAPS protocol.
Okay. And I'd love to maybe, you touched on its benefits in anxiety and depression and PTSD, and you've got a sort of chapter dedicated in your book to sort of couples as well. And I kind of feel that um, in the health space, there's obviously some information and context around this, but I think just through maybe personal experience, especially recently, sort of really experiencing the benefits in focusing on relationships ultimately. And the healthier that relationship is, the healthier we are as an individual and the happier we're going to be, etc. It's just one of those foundational pieces of a happy, healthy human. So are
Mhm.
you happy just to kind of dive into the couple side a little bit more?
Absolutely, yeah. Um, a little bit of background. In 1997, I wrote a book called Communication Miracles for Couples. And Oprah said it was the best couples book ever written, which made a New York Times bestseller. And I ended up doing a lot of couples therapy, um, which was very frustrating because the average couple waits 6 years between the time that they start to have trouble and they reach out to a counselor. Imagine if you have like a bump on your arm and you wait 6 years to see if that's cancer. You'd be dead by then, So most of the time when I was seeing couples, they were at each other's throats and literally like hating each other. And I'm trying to solve this problem. Well, trying to solve problems with people that you don't trust and who don't like each other is very, very challenging. Um, I would do a year or two of therapy. Sometimes it would go well, sometimes not. But whenever the couple would take MDMA together, they would fall in love again, and the trust would be there. Trying to solve problems with somebody you trust and love is actually quite easy.
Mhm.
So we'd come to these agreements, they'd re-stimulate their feelings for each other, and then the agreements would last because they were very separate from all their animosity. They said, yeah, this is the way to handle the kids, or this is the way to deal with sex, or this is the way to deal with money. And I would do like 3 years of therapy in an afternoon with couples. Now, MDMA originally in the 1970s got popularized because couples would take it and they would have all these breakthroughs, and therapists would use it with couples. It ends up that original thing got lost as it became a dance party drug. But
Right.
now it's coming back. And in fact, I think in June of this year, I'm going to be doing a 22-week class on how to use MDMA for couples, and through something called the Shift Network in America.
Mm.
And it will be the only class dealing with couples and MDMA in the world. And the reason I'm doing it is because it really is amazing. For anybody who's taken MDMA with somebody else in a couple, they know that, wow, that was that was really fantastic. You know, you can work through a lot of stuff very quickly.
Mm.
My wife and I wouldn't be married if it weren't for MDMA. There were times that we hit a wall and we couldn't get it through, even though I wrote the book on communication miracles for couples. You know, but with MDMA, it was like settled in a couple hours, and now we've been married 25 years.
Wow, brilliant. And I've heard that so many times with MDMA. Like it's probably the one thing that I've had most exposure to with MDMA is kind of couples therapy. And I know there are some really, I guess, a lot of people that really recommend testify are evidence of how helpful it can be. And that idea that I'm still in a marriage, I've heard that now quite a few times.
Right. I think we could lower the divorce rate to near zero if we had this available to everybody.
And I guess within that, in your book, you obviously provide sort of at least a couple of lists of questions that can be really helpful to explore. I guess if you are doing this with your partner or if you're sort of doing a self-facilitated session. Um, so I guess firstly, thank you for the list because
Mm.
they are some quite thought-provoking questions, and I just did it while reading the book, and they're just powerful. I think those sorts of questions get you contemplating things that often we just don't carve out the time to think about in our day-to-day lives.
And even if we did, we wouldn't necessarily be in the mental space to make really good use of them.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Um,
just so people know, I have probably two lists of 20 questions in there, but in the Ecstasy as Medicine book, but a couple of them that I like are in with couples, what are you afraid to ask for or say to your partner? Because those things that you're afraid to say, they're like a block in between you and your partner.
mm,
And on MDMA, it's actually quite easy to say them or to request things that you couldn't normally request, sexually or otherwise. Um, if you had no fear, how would you be different in your life? These are useful questions to contemplate. And on MDMA, people come up with very deep and profound answers that then we work to integrate into their life later in a session.
I love that question. I just think they're so great.
Mhm.
Um, have you ever done any sessions where any one of the partners on MDMA?
Yeah, I have only about 10 times. And it worked really well, surprisingly. One of the reasons I do this work is that I get a contact high.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, when one person's on MDMA, it seems like their vibration travels or something, or maybe I'm just, tuning into it. A lot of the people I train in the training I lead, they report the same thing, like, man, I'll do this for free because it was a free MDMA session, Um, so yeah, it's worked better than I would have originally thought. Um, and sometimes a person for medical reasons or other reasons don't want to take the drug, but it still can be quite
Mm.
effective.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you said, obviously, if people are on antidepressants, then it's contraindicated. But you do kind of discuss in your book, sort of, you have worked with people who have kind of tapered off their medications with sort of doctor approval,
Hmm.
and then they've gone into MDMA therapy.
Yeah, I work with a doctor both on the course that I do and privately and there's not, just antidepressants. People are on all kinds of medicines, and you
Mm,
gotta make sure that there's no contraindication with them. And sometimes there is, and sometimes they have to taper off or whatever. And working with a doctor is really important in such cases.
yeah. Okay. And I guess, I'm not sure what the statistics are these days, but essentially the majority of the US, UK population are now on meds. So it's a common factor, I guess.
What's interesting about antidepressants is studies show that they're only 1% more effective than placebos for the vast majority of people who take them.
Hmm.
Whereas MDMA is like 50% more effective, 50 times more effective in that way. So, we have been sold a bill of goods by big pharma that just taking a pill is going to help you. Well, it's basically a placebo for most people. But when you can really take a pill that accelerates the therapeutic process, that's great. The other thing I use MDMA for lately, which is quite popular, is helping people spiritually. And by spiritual, I mean the ability to tap into deeper states of love and peace easily and at will. And most people, if they spent enough time in nature or they meditate long enough, they can find a place of inner peace. But in daily life, they have a hard time because we're always moving. We don't have that time. Well, when somebody's on MDMA, I can get a lot of information by asking a lot of questions as to what is helping them to trigger this inner peace and open state. And then that's kind of a breadcrumb trail back to that state when they're not on the medicine.
Mm.
Now, speaking personally, I've meditated, for 50 years. But it used to take me like, 40 minutes of meditation before I was really in an open state. With the help of MDMA and what I've learned from it, it now takes only about 30 seconds to get to the same experience. And that's because I have more distinctions as to what helps trigger that state in me. And that changed my life. I mean, it's nice to only be 30 seconds away from inner peace.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really powerful. And you share that in the book, obviously, as well, sort of how you can, I don't know if reverse engineering would be the right term, but sort of, yeah, kind of understanding some of those little cues that are required to help you get into that state.
Yeah, it really is helpful. And surprisingly, people generally don't know how they do that unless they get asked very precise questions.
Mm. Yeah, and the question though, yeah,
Hmm.
that's a good point. They are very, very precise. Um, is there anything that we haven't yet covered that you would like to just bring into the conversation?
Well, there's a couple levels to talk about these things, and you're asking great questions in terms of the psychological aspect, the um, and the intellectual part of this. But I like to think of it that these are sacred medicines. They've been around for thousands of years. We've created cultures in the West, especially, that banned them and made them wrong. But as we are trying to accelerate our evolution and heal ourselves, they're coming back. And I think that it's not a coincidence that in this day and age where people are suffering from a lot of mental health challenges, that we're getting a second try at using these medicines correctly. And the studies are showing that they're a lot more effective than whatever big pharma's putting out there. So I think it's an exciting time. And to me, they do have a kind of a sacred element to them that, you know, uh, I can meet a relative stranger. We can create a heart to heart connection and we can go deep and really um, remove some of the clouds that have been in the way of peace, love, connection with a higher power, connection with other people, and that this medicine is really a tonic for our times, and it's very exciting. And that some people are called to work with that medicine to see if they can heal. A lot of therapists, they burn out because they're doing therapy but the results are so slow and it's like pulling teeth to get people to see something, whether they're addicted to something or they have a neurosis that a pattern that keeps getting in the way. So I was a very impatient psychotherapist, And that's why, working with this medicine has just been a whole opening door of really satisfying my need for seeing change in people. And it's changed how I look at people, that rather than seeing them as a ball of constriction and neurosis that is trying not to change, I get in touch with the part of us that is a soul that wants to change, that wants to find peace and connect with others. And once you are connected with that part of a person, it's 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 a very sacred experience that is hard to describe unless you've done that. So, I tell people, if they're interested in learning to do that, go to mdmatraining.net and see if it's for you. Um, but for me, it's been a really moving journey to have this technological breakthrough.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I think sacred is a word that resonates. I do from psilocybin, but also with breath work as well.
Mhm.
And you just, as you say, tap into that part of ourselves. I don't think there's a better word than the word sacred. And I
Yeah.
think in one of my most recent journeys, that sort of realization that ultimately everything is sacred, and how we relate to putting out the trash can be a sacred act in a very, very subtle way.
Yeah, yeah. As if you have the right state of consciousness, and our state of consciousness can shift rather dramatically if you know a method that works really well for you. And I will
Mm,
say that also, different medicines work for different people. I'd say
yeah.
5% of the people I work with, I feel like, this isn't their medicine. Maybe psilocybin or ketamine is, but people are different, and uh, you got to find what works for you. And if
Mm,
you try enough things, you will find, wow, that was incredible. I tried ibogaine. That's a big medicine now. Didn't work for me. I didn't like it. Didn't do anything. But I know other people that they say it changed their life. So you got to see. Our bodies and minds are different. We need different things at different times. And I encourage people to experiment and explore.
yeah. I have a kind of a colleague, I guess, who is um very kind of adamant on that for sort of the therapist as well. This idea that if we want to have an experience understanding of these different medicines, to maybe get a sense of what might be best for our clients, or whoever, however we might want to frame it. And I kind of like
Mhm.
that idea as well. Um I don't know I don't know how to put this, but um it feels like from everything you've shared and reading your book and speaking to people I know who have taken MDMA, that in some ways it could be a safer medicine. I think, with psilocybin, it can often take you to dark things, and it can be incredibly heavy. Um, Whereas MDMA, the impression I get is, and I might be very wrong here, but it's lighter. It feels like there's a lighter energy to it, maybe. Is there any truth
Well,
to that?
I totally agree with that. So I've led, let's say, 750 sessions. Of the 750, one person had a very challenging time.
Okay.
Whereas with psilocybin, that's why I'll do MDMA therapy over Zoom, because
Mm,
I consider it, as safe as doing this over Zoom.
right.
I talked to 750 people doing them. One person's probably going to have a challenging time. But on psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, I'd say maybe 15 to 20% have a very challenging time. And that's why I won't do those sessions over Zoom.
Sure.
So yeah, it is in a different class, and we put this under the umbrella of psychedelics, but each of these medicines have very different effects, and MDMA in particular is pretty much never leads to a bad experience. It's pretty much unheard of, so that is a nice advantage of it.
Brilliant. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on and talking about it. I'll put links into the show notes for everything that you've mentioned throughout today's call. Is there anything that you would like to sort of just conclude with at all?
Well, yeah, okay. There's a one story I would like to conclude with that touched me and kind of created the mission that I'm now doing. As you might know, Alex, I've interviewed a lot of spiritual leaders, ranging from late Mother Teresa to the Dalai Lama. I went to interview this guy named Punjaji in India, a famous guru. And when I went to his place, he told me to sit like right in front of him, like, 6 inches from him. And he got real close to me and he like stared at me with his piercing eyes and he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Jonathan from the United States." Well, he was asking a Ramana Maharshi question. I didn't realize, what the protocol was. So he just laughed and he said, "No, who are you really?" So it occurred to me to say, well, I'm a writer, or I'm a psychotherapist, or I'm a husband, or I'm a man. I went through all these roles for like 2 minutes, and he's just shaking his head, no, no, no. Well, finally, I ran out of roles, so I'm looking at him, and he literally had light coming out of his eyes. I was kind of transfixed. And as I looked at him, like time just kind of stopped, and everything got silent. And then all of a sudden, this wave of energy hit me that felt like pure unconditional love. And I'd never felt anything quite like this. It was so strong that I just started weeping in his lap. And as I'm weeping in his lap, feeling all this love, he pats me on the head and he says, "This love that you're feeling now, that's who you are. That's who human beings are. And your job is to get back to that love any way you can." And that stayed with me, that we have a job to do. And it's not to make money or achieve a certain thing, it's to find inner peace and love. And we now have a medicine that can really help with that if
Mm.
used in the correct way. So I feel honored that I get to use this and lead other people in it, and hopefully it will help heal a lot of people.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that story. When I read that in your book, I had a wave of energy come up. I could see
Oh,
myself in that
beautiful.
situation with the exact same experience.
Yeah, yeah, it was very powerful. It still helps me feel my mission today.
Yeah, I bet. Brilliant. Jonathan, thank you so much. I hope that one day I will see you on your training. But for now, continue with your mission. And I look forward to sharing this with our community.
Well, thank you for the great questions, Alex. I appreciate it.